This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. Hey, what's up, and welcome to Q&A, the show where I take your questions from YouTube and Twitter and answer them here in video format. Tons of questions to get into. We're going to start with Anthony, and Anthony's question says, how many weeks are you giving Watts until you are worried, or if you think he'll be worried at all? Now, I don't know exactly what you mean by worried. Like, are we talking about injury worried? Are we talking about quality of play worried? If you're talking about a shoulder injury, I do not care about that shoulder injury anymore. As far as I know, he's been recovered from that shoulder injury for a long time. The people at practice say that that shoulder does not look like it's a problem. He can throw the ball. He hasn't lost zip, all of this stuff. The shoulder injury, if he plays bad, is not to blame for why he's playing bad. This is not, we're not going to do Baker Mayfield 2021 again, where we're talking about the labrum. The shoulder is fine. And I say that as somebody who does think that Deshaun Watson will play well or better than most people expect him to play this year. Now, that being said, how I'm going to measure how he looks, especially early in the season, isn't going to be off a strict guideline of how many yards he throws in a game and if it's 300 yards or not. What I'm going to do is watch each game, see where the mistakes are. If the mistakes feel like they're coming from the variety of mistakes that would happen because you don't have great familiarity amongst the entire roster with what you're running offensively. So wide receivers aren't in place. Wide receivers are dropping the ball because they're not really comfortable being where they're supposed to be yet. Like things like that. If those are the mistakes or those are the things that are slowing down Deshaun Watson, I am fine with. If what's slowing down Deshaun Watson is like some of the stuff that was slowing him down in 2022, where he was errant with his mechanics and, you know, not very accurate with the football, not seeing the middle of the field well, like that kind of stuff I won't have patience for. But it really matters how the mistakes happen, if the mistakes happen, for if I will be worried about it, if that makes sense. So it's not a matter of time, it's a matter of evidence that I see. If I see a lot of evidence in week one that he's going to have a significant issue playing football this year, then I'm going to be worried in week one. I'm not going to wait till I get even more evidence in week two if all of that evidence points to things that don't feel like their first game of the season related, right? Because sometimes you do have issues just because it's the first game of the season. That being said, I don't like putting weeks on it. I'm just going to take it by what is seen and what the evidence shows and what the film shows when I go through it, because I will be going through the film every week. So that's kind of how I'm going to wait to judge this and be worried about it or not. The one lovely says this: hey Q, with David Bell and how David Bell played last year and the plays he made when we called his name and we kept on the 53-man roster, do you see him as one, if not our go-to guy on fourth down? He's not going to be your go-to guy on fourth down just because your go-to guy on fourth down is going to be Amari Cooper. Because Amari Cooper, like everything David Bell does, Amari Cooper does a million times better. But that doesn't mean that there's not a place for him, right? Like just because he's not the go-to guy, he can be, you know, if you see a look and you want to invert it, you can trust that David Bell could run that look, invert it, and get open. Like he just gives you more flexibility on fourth down and another option to trust. So I think that's going to be his role, right? And I think that's a fine role for him to have, and a role that, you know, I think people will eventually start to appreciate with him. Mike Ford Season says this: how confident are you in the backfield going into the season? I'm pretty confident in the backfield going into the season, like as far as like where my expectations are versus where the public is, I don't know where I'm at on that. I'm not expecting the backfield to be amazing when Nick Chubb's not in there. Here's what I want the backfield to be: solid enough in between the big plays. Last year, it was a desert before a big play on the ground, right? Like you go through 3 drives of nothing on the ground, and then Jerome Ford break off a 20-yard, and then you go back to the desert. I like that Jerome Ford can break off those big runs, and I think there's a place for him on this team because of that. But you got to do better with the in-between. It can't be a drought. It could be a little dry, but it can't be a drought. You got to be able to get 3 yards, 4 yards here when you need it. And I think that's going to be how I judge this backfield. As far as my confidence in them being able to do that, I feel like they'll be a little bit better at it just because I think Andy Dickerson will be better at calling up those kind of run plays and, doing some of the more simplified stuff from the run game that the Browns are going to be doing, right? Some guard center guard stuff, some RPO stuff. Like, I think we're going to vary it enough to kind of bring this offense into the 21st century that it's going to make a difference. This question comes from Stacks, and Stacks says this: one more from me. Is there any concern about Nick Chubb taking a step back? His injury is a pretty bad one, and I hope to see him at his best. But there's always a question mark when it comes to injuries like that. I do think there is concern that Nick Chubb will not be Nick Chubb anymore. Now, what does that mean for him? Because being Nick Chubb means one of the best running backs in the NFL. I think there's that concern. There are a lot of different ways to go about it. My thing with Nick Chubb is that he's demonstrated himself to be an outlier. And until he demonstrates himself not to be an outlier anymore, I have to assume that he's going to continue to be an outlier. So I think Nick Chubb is likely going to play pretty close to what he was. And he's come off injury before and played really good football. Not just the time at Georgia where he came back from a debilitating knee injury, but other times in the NFL where he came back from injuries during the course of a season and played really well. I think of 2020 as a good example of that. So when it comes to Nick Chubb, I'm just not going to underestimate him. And that's what I would encourage people to do. You don't got to overestimate him. You don't got to say that he's guaranteed to come back and be Nick Chubb. But I wouldn't start talking as if it's a done foregone conclusion that Nick Chubb's not going to be who he used to be coming off this injury. Because, again, he's one of those players that have earned the benefit of the doubt. Biller here says, why did Hudson make the team over Jermaine Ifedi? How do I put this kindly? James Hudson did not have a good camp. James Hudson was heavily criticized. Jermaine Ifedi was significantly worse than James Hudson. And to be fair to James Hudson, he's demonstrated in NFL games he can come in and play right tackle. The Browns have demonstrated that if they have to deal with a practice squad tackle like Garon Christian, or Garon Christian, my bad, not Garon. It's not Conley, it's Christian. So Garon Christian. If they got to deal with that, they have ways to deal with that. Right? As much as we know Garon Christian ended up being a problem versus the Texans, we know that the Browns were able to hold up with him for a little while to the point where y'all thought he was better than Jed Wills at one point. I remember getting the messages. Y'all was out here telling me he was better than Jed Wills. Browns was window dressing. They can window dress around James Hudson if James Hudson ever has to play. But the reason Jermaine Ifedi did not make the roster and James Hudson did is because Jermaine Ifedi demonstrated himself in the preseason to be cooked. Like, he looked cooked. Like, I don't think anybody else picked up Jermaine Ifedi. Maybe somebody would do it on their practice squad, but he looks done. He looks done. Like go back and look. I did a film breakdown. Go back and look at Jermaine Ifedi when he was out there with the ones, and tell me that's much different than what you saw out of James Hudson. And honestly, it is much different because I think James Hudson was significantly better. So, like I said earlier this year, they were going to give James Hudson enough rope to play himself off the roster. He played himself onto the roster because Jermaine Ifedi played himself off the roster. Next question comes from Mark, who says, with AB's ability to draft DBs, is it time to start looking at getting Ward's money off the books, especially when his concussions are piling up? I see no reason to be in a rush to get Ward's contract off the book, because as long as Denzel Ward can play football, it is worth dealing with the 2 games a year he misses. Yeah, I'll live with that. If that means I get Denzel Ward for 15 games or 85% of the games that he's going to be eligible for, then you'll deal with that. It's definitely not worth getting his contract off the books. It's not that bad. I know people tend to exaggerate, but this is one of them things where people have exaggerated significantly, is Denzel Ward's injury history. He's good to play most of the season. This is not a situation where he keeps having season-ending injury after season-ending injury. Like, Jack Conklin is significantly more injury-prone in a more concerning way than Denzel Ward is, as far as like their ability to stay on the field. The thing that's concerning about Denzel is more on the humane level than it is about his ability to play football in the short term, right? Because the concussions, you worry about that affecting his life after football. That's what the concern for Denzel is. Or if he'll retire early. Now, do you give Denzel Ward an extension? I think you got to think about that. But as far as his contract right now, you'd be silly to get rid of his contract because he's still Denzel Ward, and that's still a huge part of what the Browns like to do. And like, you could be as good as you want drafting corners, you ain't gonna find Denzel Ward sitting out in the 3rd, 4th round or the 2nd round. There's a reason you had to draft Denzel Ward in the top 5 of a loaded draft class in 2018, because dudes like Denzel don't come around every week. So yeah, I think there's no reason to be in a rush with this Denzel Ward thing. It's not like he has back-to-back season-ending injuries or anything like that. He's just kind of in and out the lineup a couple times a year. The next question comes from Stacks, who says this. Bengal fan here. I'd like to know what your prediction for Watson is. Completely unbiased. Will he be the guy he was at Houston? Will he be the same since he's arrived in Cleveland? Or will he be somewhere in the middle? I don't even think there's a bar to measure him on what he's been in Cleveland, because if you just look at the sample since he's come back, it is such a bad sample to pick from. And I think if you put like 90% if you put every quarterback in the game in that situation that he's been in, like 90 of them will produce questionable results in those situations, right? He came back from a 700-day layoff. He looked bad, had some moments in 2022, but looked bad. Comes back, plays 3 games. First game is in a monsoon. Nobody could throw the ball. Joe Burrow was even worse than DESHAUN. DESHAUN actually played better than Joe Burrow in that game. But the monsoon happened, so the passing numbers aren't going to be great in that one. But I thought he played well. Week 2 versus Pittsburgh is where everybody got to see him, and he did not play well in that game. He played bad. Week 3, he plays pretty good. You think you're on the roll, it's about to start going, and then he gets injured. And then he comes back, plays well versus Arizona, and then plays well against Baltimore, plays really good against Baltimore, and then he gets injured again. It's just been so start and stop that I can't take any of the data that you've gotten from him in Cleveland seriously. So I don't think we know where he's at, to be honest with you. I think he can be in that tier of quarterbacks at the very least that Tua and Brock Purdy exist in. The question is, can he get to the tier of quarterbacks that a Dak is at, or Lamar Jackson's at, or Joe Burrow or Justin Herbert is at? I'm not sure. I got to see it. I'm not going to just put somebody in that tier. But that's the question with DESHAUN. I think he'll be, one of the better starters in the NFL by the end of the season. I'm pretty sure about that based off, the small sample that we saw of him in last year in those, 5 starts. But anything above and beyond that, well, it's going to be hard to guess, because we just don't have enough information. But I want to thank you for asking that question. I want to thank you guys for asking the questions. Y'all have a great day. Have a better night. Peace.